In the last section, we finished up our spinner component. So we can place the spinner anywhere, specify the size that we want, and the spinner should appear on the screen centered in the horizontal direction because we added in some styling to make sure that's the case. We'll now flip over to our login form file and make sure that we show the spinner inside of here. So now our goal, or what we have to figure out how to do, is we have to say that whenever a user clicks on the button, whenever they click on this thing attempting to log in, I want to hide this button, and instead I want to show that spinner. Okay, so that's the goal here. I need to either show this button or show the spinner. So what I'm really talking about doing here is I'm talking about kind of re-rendering the component on the fly with some amount of different content, right? And so again, whenever I say re-render, you got to be thinking about state. That is how we cause our component to re-render. So I'm going to suggest that we add in a new piece of state to this component called loading. And loading should be a Boolean. Whenever the Boolean loading is false, that means that we are not making a request, we're not trying to sign the user in, and so we should show the button on the screen. But whenever whenever the piece of state of loading is true, that means that we must be attempting to log the user in, and so we should show the spinner on the screen instead of the button. Okay, so that's going to be our goal here. So again, whenever we use state, we will first default our property. So I will add on a loading piece of state called false, or with a value of false, excuse me. So by default, I am not loading anything. I am not attempting to make a request. So by default, when the component first renders, we have loading of false. Next, when we start to issue our request, when the user presses the button, I want to make sure that I immediately show the spinner on the screen to let them know, yep, we are showing the spinner, we are trying to log you in right now. We want to give our user that feedback. So inside of on button press, I will want to update my state to have loading of true so that we can re-render the component and show the spinner instead of the button. So to update our piece of loading state, I do not need to create a separate set state call. I can change as many variables on my state object as I want inside of a single set state call. So I will also pass in here loading of true. So the instant that a user presses the button, we're going to clear out any existing errors that are on the screen, and we're also going to flip this loading flag to true. Now the last thing that we have to do is figure out inside of our render method whether or not we should show this button or the spinner. So that's the last thing we have to do here. Whenever I kind of do this conditional rendering of sorts, either show this or show that, I like to extract this logic to a separate helper method to make the decision for me. So I'm going to create another helper method called render button. And inside of here, we will either return some amount of JSX to show the spinner, or we will show some amount of JSX to show the button tag. So I will say if this.state.loading. So if this.state.loading is true, because remember this is a Boolean right here, so we don't have to do like equals 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 true. We don't have to do that. It can be just this.state.loading. Then I want to return my spinner. And I have not yet imported my spinner, but I will in just a second here. I also want to make sure that the spinner is small, so I'm going to pass in a size prop of small. Remember we wired up this size prop just a moment ago. So if I'm currently loading, return the spinner. Otherwise, I want to return my button tag. So right here we'll return the button. So I'm going to scroll on down to the button and we're going to cut and paste it up. So here's my button. I'm going to cut it and I'm going to scroll back up to my method. And in the return statement, I'll place the button here. Now notice that I'm using an if. I could be using an if-else statement here. So I could say if this.state.loading else do this. I kind of like this different syntax here, or this different pattern where I say if some condition, return immediately and with this object, otherwise just return this object by default. So it's totally up to you. This can be an if-else. I kind of like this other pattern instead. So now the last thing we have to do is make sure that we call this render button method from inside of our render method. So I'm going to scroll back down all the way to our last card section here. and I'm going to call this dot render button like so. So we haven't really done a lot of this before, but we absolutely can have helper methods that return some amount of JSX and then call those from within our render method. And that's exactly what we're doing here. I've got this render button method that will return some amount of JSX. And I can call it directly from within my existing other block of JSX. And as a matter of fact, we can compose blocks of JSX out of as many method or render calls or method calls as we want, excuse me. So we can very freely use functions all over the place to compose our render method. All right, I think the last thing we have to do is make sure that we import the spinner component because we've still not done that. So at the very top, I'm going to find my import statement from our common directory, and I'm also going to import spinner. Okay, so I think it's time for a little bit of a test now. I'm going to flip over to the simulator, and I'll enter in some credentials, and then I will log in. And fantastic, we get that nice spinner there to let our user know, hey, just so you know, something's in progress here. We are currently attempting to log you in. So this is great. Now, the only thing that we're doing now is we are not handling the case in which the request actually succeeds or fails, right? At some point in time, the spinner has to go away. So we need to make sure that at some point we hide the spinner from the screen. So let's take care of that in the next section.